So we'll start, Reverend Rogers. Thank you again for taking time to speak with me. And I had some follow-up questions from our first interview, and then I also wanted to move ahead to talk about your time as Race Relations Secretary, your work with Howard Thurman, and but I wonder if we could go back at the outset to Quincy. And there were two stories you told me that I wanted to see if I could get a little more information on.
Sure.
One was a story that involved your grandmother, or Mrs. Hattie Paramore, and an incident where she'd went to a store. I think you said it was owned by George Knowles, or a Mr. Knowles, and he had cursed at her. Do you remember did you know what he said to her?
No, I know. I don't know what the word was, but I guess a better way to say it is the atmosphere of race 40 years ago or more. I think it's fair to say it was different in some measure to what it is now. However, a qualifying thing to say would be that I think I touched on it last time. Quincy had a sociological quality that had the stuff of alertness, which is why I deliberately used the term that James Weldon Johnson made famous when we were talking the last time, because it has sociological significance. The term bad nigger has sociological meaning. Another more nice way of saying it is that you had in places a given kind of toughness that identified the atmosphere. The incident about my grandmother would be a good way of saying what I've just said in a different way. The nomenclature bad nigger was simply a sociological situation in which you had to think twice in a situation where the white man was the white man. And you were supposed to do what he said or he'd kill you. Quincy was the kind of place where that was true, but it was also true that you had to think twice. Now, my brother was two things. First of all, I told you how bright he was. He was probably the brightest man in town, black and white. He was gentlemanly. He was well liked, with the odd fact that if you moved in the wrong way, in the direction of the slavery syndrome, John's oddness was that on the one hand, he was the best kind of person you could meet. On the other hand, he'd kill you. which is a way of saying that this is a part of the bad nigger syndrome. Little John was not afraid of anything. Again, I reiterate, he was as nice as you could find a man. And he'd kill you as quick as a bad nigger would. Now, Mr. Knowles was in a town which was a southern town, where the normal relationship between blacks and whites would be what you would have to enter in on. The character of the community was one which involved blacks and Indians. Of course, they were in that same moment that there were, the United States had to move in. Mm-hmm. And you had an odd kind of situation like that. I would not say that this was a regularity.
Right.
But there was always the possibility. And if you ran into the fellow that I call by the nomenclature, didn't matter how white you were, you would be in a situation that you'd have to watch. Now, Little John never killed anybody, but he was the kind of man who could do that. To add again what I tried to say the last time, my grandmother was almost the kind of person that carried huge respect. And she was tough with the other odd kind of thing that she had a kind of guile. You could call her Hattie if you wanted to. It didn't disturb her at all. She could play her side of the fence in such wise that your insulting approach would be meat in her hand. Instead of you controlling her, she would control you. She didn't care enough about your thought along that line to respond in a way that other people might respond to want to kill you. I mean, you were playing in her hand. It was on basis of that kind of situation that enabled her, while acting like what a nigger was supposed to be, that made her boss man. What is the phrase they used to use? Put Mr. Charlie on.
Yeah.
She was perfect at that. And instead of it bringing the kind of response that would demean her in her own mind, she was boss lady. She could walk into the, I mentioned to you, did I mention the Coca-Cola syndrome to you?
Oh, right, yeah.
We had about 7 millionaires, of course they were all white, where they so early, my understanding is that if you were in such position as to have been able to have gotten Coca-Cola stock, you are moving in that regard. So that the odd combination in my effort to describe my grandmother, she was top dog because of the odd kind of respect whites had for her in terms of what she could do, and her movement as a member of the community, despite how oddly I describe it, she did have power. And the character of that power was revealed in the incident that you're making me talk about again. Was you couldn't tamper with her. She had the kind of respect that involved a skillful black person who had the kind of brightness to be able to ignore what other kinds of blacks would have been insulted by. Again, I'd reiterate, she did not have enough respect for white folks' guile to insult her in the first place because she didn't care about the mentality of that kind of white. Therefore, Mr. Knowles, again, was a bad white man, you see, who got respect because he was a bad white man, again tempered by the fact that you had, again, what I call the bad niggers. And there were more people similar to my brother who were not as bright as he was. Little John had the unusual combination of, in effect, being what I call, again, the bad nigger. At the same time, he was probably the brightest individual in town. And that was the character of that moment. And the reason Mr. Knowles left, because he knew Little John. And so he stayed away from the store that was right in front of our house for almost 10 days until things were over. And then they came back to normal. Again, to repeat again, there was an odd, I say that odd, maybe it wasn't so odd, but blacks and Indians, of course, you may have run into some of this in the stuff that you wrote. I don't know whether you did or not. But blacks and Indians, in an odd kind of way, were together. The kind of sociological strength that brought laid a foundation that was almost always there, was there when I was growing up. Of course, black folk did catch hell, but the battle was still there. Again, I add that there were as many black, sometimes more blacks than there were white people. Mm-hmm. That added to the Indian group, created a kind of complex.
Yeah.
That was the foundation for the growth that you see there today, which is categorically different from what it was before. Almost, I won't say all, the strength of black people in Quincy now is so high now that it's not unwise to say that the black folk are here almost while the white folk were here. Almost all, I think you'll find, even in so short a time since you've been there, almost all the power facts in Quincy are white. Mayor, owners of various places. I would, of course, say that white folk, because of the cumulative character of what I'm trying to describe, would still be on top. But the political growth is not unwise to say.
Well, I think that's why Patricia Stevens Dew and John Dew, I think we talked about this last week, why they moved back from Miami to Quincy.
That's true.
And they tried to explain to their friends in Miami, who said, why would you want to move back to that backwards area? And they said, no, you don't understand Quincy.
Yeah, well, that's correct. We had, I told you that the one black doctor that was in town that you wrote about, he was my doctor when I was born. There was one doctor then, and they had to, he went there to, what did they do? Internship. And the black folk got on him and begged him to stay. And he stayed. He was there just that one. Now, there are at least 6 doctors in Quincy. And they are also, they own stuff like the drugstores again and the pharmacists thing. They are really on top in a major way. And sociologically, you would have to go back to that early beginning when they were on the bottom with the kind of strength that they had then. That was the foundation for where they are, or where they are now.
Reverend Rogers, I wonder if we could talk about just a few more minutes, those 10 days. I want to make sure that I understand what happened. Now, little John, his surname was Paramore, John Paramore? Or?
Yeah, little John was my half-brother.
Your half-brother, okay. Yeah. So he was John Paramore.
Yeah.
And this particular incident that we're talking about happened, how old were you when it happened?
I guess I had to be, I lived in Jacksonville from birth. I was born in Quincy. I told you about my grandmother's industry.
Yes, sir.
She had property in a great number of places, and she owned property in Jacksonville. And we went to Jacksonville when I was born, and I stayed in Jacksonville from the time I was born, although I would be going to Quincy every summer.
Yeah.
Until my father died, and he died at when I was 11 or 12 years of age, and then we moved back to Quincy. So I had 2 places that could easily be called home, Jacksonville and Quincy. And the incident that you were asking about happened maybe 2-3 years after we moved back to Quincy. So I don't know what the exact age was, but it was around, say, 13 or 14.
13 or 14. So when this was happening, you were old enough to know what was happening.
I mean, oh, yeah. We were, Quincy was a little bit odd, and we were a little bit odd. I knew everything that happened. The character, the sociological character, how can I say this? There was little, if any, significant type of fear that we normally describe when we are making an effort to do justice between the chasm between blacks and whites. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to be as accurate as I can. Aside from sensible respect for power in a given municipality, I'm not trying to make my family look great. On the one hand. On the other hand, there was almost none of the kind of fear that you would use in a general description of the relationship between whites and blacks. Aside from the stuff of routine common sense and knowing what the strength is here and the strength is there, I had no fear that would fundamentally describe a kind of characterological decorum that would govern normal growth. My family did not have, in a given area of sociological and cultural growth, any significant fear of the white public. If anything, the decorum that would define the regularity of the kind of action that would be typical of us, you couldn't put fear in that at all, on the one hand. On the other hand, the ableness of cultural decorum, it would sound like I'm bragging. But the truth is, if there were any comparison between the white community and better than a handful, like Dr. Stevens' family, like the fellow who owned the Ice House, if you would compare people on that level, it would be like playing marbles. Mm-hmm. I couldn't honestly say to you that there was an academic inferiority of a wide gap on the white side. It just wasn't so. And because of that, again, I reiterate, the cultural level as it is now grew out of that kind of foundation. I'm not now saying that we, in terms of overall power, were superior to the whites. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that what you see now grew out of what there was then.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know, does the name Sal de la Folle mean anything to you?
Oh, yeah, the famous surgeon, and he also knew Dr. Stevens, and yeah.
He finished A&M College with a straight A average.
Mm-hmm.
He finished the med school at Howard University with a straight A average. He was well enough known for more than once for the White House to send for him.
Right.
That is a kind of accurate description of what was the basis for what adequately defines what Quincy was.
And it all came out
and I think your book lends some credence to that.
It all came out of Quincy is so key. What, just Reverend Rogers, just a couple more questions about the 10 days. Now, when you
about what?
About those 10 days.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So little John came out on the porch that first evening after he heard that his grandmother had been cussed at, and he had a shotgun. He sat on the porch with the shotgun. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
Okay. And did he just sit on the porch with the shotgun that evening, or?
I can't say how long. I'm saying that for a number of days,
Mm-hmm.
little John did what I said he did.
Yeah.
It would be fair to say that most people knew little John. It was not as accidental as it seems that Mrs. Knowles left. Little John was both normal and not normal. He wasn't somebody you'd be scared of. He wasn't crazy. If anything, he might have been considered as gentle a man as you've ever seen. I have his picture here. I'd show it to you. He was a funny dude. Overwhelmingly well-liked. But as the boys would say nowadays, he did not take any crap.
Yeah.
None.
None.
No insulting crap. On the one hand. On the other hand, he was easy to get along with. He had a kind of ego because he was bright. He was head man of his class in Jacksonville, Florida. They would exempt him from all kinds of examination. He was just that kind of brilliant.
Yeah.
You see.
Yeah.
So I've never seen him get in a fight, except in Jacksonville once. But he sounds more abnormal when I'm telling you about him than he was.
No, he sounds like a human being.
Yeah.
Yeah, who loved his
grandmother. And he was well liked.
Yeah, and he loved his grandmother.
Yeah, well, that was something else. The dude was moving down the wrong street then. He was moving down the wrong street.
Yeah.
Because, we were afraid of little John. He wouldn't do a lot of talking to you. He would act, you see.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, he was not dangerous at all. Did you ever run into a dude when you were growing up that you just didn't bother?
Oh, yes.
Oh, that was little John. That was little John. So I don't want to make him sound like he was a goon. That was not the case. He was almost too nice in some senses. But it was a moment that frightened her. Because when I said little John would kill you, I mean that. And I've seen a whole lot of people like that.
Yeah.
I could name some people in the movement that you've lived through that were like that. A fellow who was as calm as Little John was. He was not as dangerous in a way as Little John was. One of my best friends was Stokely Carmichael. Mm-hmm. You didn't play with Stokely. On the one hand, if you knew him, you couldn't find a nicer guy than Stokely. When he came here, I brought him here to Stetson, and I couldn't get him out of the mall. The white folk just mobbed him. He was overwhelmingly beautiful dude. But when it came, you know who was responsible, in my judgment, and I was close to all of them, for Martin King's movement against Vietnam? Stokely Carmichael. The incident that we talk about all the time, Stokely and Martin, as much as they seem to be different, they were just like that. Martin called Stokely on a given Saturday night. Stokely had been the fellow who was most impressive for Martin in terms of the temptation to confront the Vietnam War. And on this Saturday night, Martin called Stokely. And this was during the moment, I don't know whether you know enough about the movement to be aware that Stokely Carmichael was the person most responsible for voting growing in the South. Of course, he led the movement. Mm-hmm. Martin and Stokely were, a lot of people didn't know it, but they were just like that. And of course, Stokely had been trying to get Martin to oppose the Vietnam War. And Martin you didn't do it. And on this Saturday night, during the moment when Stokely was building the voting in the South, and he was the principal person doing that, Martin called him and said, Stokely, he said, I want you to be in church tomorrow. And Stokely said, Reverend, he said, I got work to do. He was organizing the movement for voting. Mm-hmm. He said, I don't have time to be in church. I've got my work to do. Martin said, well, I want you to be here because I'm condemning and I'm going to act on the war in my sermon tomorrow morning. It's in one of the books that we have on that period. And the book said that there was 2 minutes of silence. Nobody said anything. Yes. Stokely said, Reverend, I'll be on the front seat. And it was the next day that Martin, at his church in Atlanta, condemned the war. And 2 weeks from then, he also condemned it at the big church in New York City.
Oh, Riverside.
Yeah, that's right.
Riverside, yes.
So that you had people like Stokely who played a major role in the successful effort mm-hmm. that led to, I guess, because Martin knew it all the time, because we used to follow him to surround him, to keep him from getting shot at. But what I'm trying to say now that I can't say well enough, that was the moment.
Yeah. Reverend Rogers, let me ask you, I want to ask you one more question about Quincy. You had mentioned that your grandmother's house was burned down.
Yeah.
How old were you when that happened? Do you remember?
The house was burned before I moved back to Quincy.
Okay.
I wasn't there when the house burned. I was in Jacksonville. Because, as I said, from the time of my birth until my father died, until I was about 12 or 13 years of age, I was in Jacksonville. And the house burned during the while I was in Jacksonville. So I did not see the burning because I moved back to Quincy after that first 12 years.
Yeah. And by then the house had been rebuilt?
Yeah.
What street was that on? I think you may have told me, but
Allen Street.
Allen Street.
My address there was 314 South Allen Street.
Okay. And that's very near, is that near the courthouse? Or
it's 2.5 blocks from the courthouse.
From the courthouse.
I could almost spit on the courthouse.
Right.
And between the courthouse and my house, there was the jail, chain gang. So I could almost take a brick and stand on my porch and I could almost hit the chain gang. And one of the, I guess it's close to a trauma for me, was having to see them going out and coming back. I saw that every day. Every living day. And again, the courthouse, the chain gang was about as far from the courthouse that you've seen as my house was from the chain gang. If I had to mention what came closer to a trauma for me than any other regular thing, it was that chain gang.
That chain gang.
And you could hear them coming back.
Yeah.
To the place where they had to tell. And they had, I don't know whether you've ever seen the kind of uniforms they wear.
Yeah.
But it would be stripes.
The stripes. What made it so traumatic for you as a young boy to see that? What was so scary or?
It was an overt, unavoidable sign of complete disregard for humanity. That was as close to a trauma as any childhood experience that I had. Because it was right downtown. It was right downtown. I kid you not. I could have stood in front of Dr. Stevens' drugstore and blown your brains out if you come out of the courthouse. That's as close to a traumatic experience that I could point to. It was an unavoidable sign of what for me was a complete disregard of black life. That's the best I can put that. Because I had to see that every day.
Every day.
Every day. There wasn't any way for me to get around seeing that. And to see a bunch of human beings And a lot of times they would have chains on the legs. It was as close to what you could symbolize as slavery, because it was complete disregard. You've never seen a chain, have you?
Just on the movies.
Yeah. Well, that was every day for me.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Rogers, I wonder if we could jump ahead. There is I know of no other individual in my lifetime who is able to express or talk about the character and the impact and the being of Howard Thurman as yourself. I mean, you have a knowledge of Reverend Thurman that is deep and profound. Can you tell me about him when you first got to know him and what kind of a man he was?
That's a good question. Thurman was a man with the kind of character and insight whose spiritual and sociological ableness that would defy the capacity to predict what made him as unusual as he was. You could say opposite things about Thurman that would also be true. He was like LaFall was, and different from him in that he grew up in Daytona when the highest that the city afforded for students who were black was 8th grade. He was reared by a grandmother. He had mother and grandmother. Grandmother was a slave. The environment was a poor environment, even though they did have a house. Like Dr. LaFall from Quincy, he was an A student from beginning to end. Valedictorian of the 8th grade, he had valedictorian of high school, valedictorian at Morehouse College. Graduated. He was a straight A student in seminary. All A's. If you never heard Thurman talk, you wouldn't think he came from Daytona. You might have thought that was that great school in England?
Cambridge or Oxford? Or,
Oxford. If you heard him talk, mind you now, someone grew up in Daytona, reared by a slave grandmother. I talked to my grandson a lot about it, and how would you pronounce the term O-N-L-Y? Pronounce it for me. What's that? What
Only.
You know what his pronunciation for that was? Only. Huh. And I listened to him. Some of them were raised in Little Bit Far. So I decided I thought this is odd. Then I did what he did. I got the dictionary just to see what the pronunciation would be. You know what it was? Only. There's a jazz orchestra, there's a jazz saxophonist that you may have heard of. Ali, what's his name from Cannonball.
Oh, Adderley, yeah. He played with Miles, and yeah.
Cannonball Adderley, like Dr. Thurman, was a straight A student. We were friends. And a friend of mine who was not my teacher, but she was formerly the president of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. And she told me one day, she said, Cannonball does things to hide his brightness. I thought she was putting me on. But if you've ever heard him play, he talks a lot. And he likes to talk. I think I was in Boston because we knew each other. And I listened to the way he would pronounce words. And one day, like Thurman, he was running off his mouth, and then he said, well, this was only. You don't know that Cannonball Adderley was a straight A student. So these things just fascinated me. Now, Howard Thurman was crazy about music. And he was our guest on a couple of occasions. My son can tell you that I'm a music hound and a jazz fan. Thurman stayed with us that night because he was preaching for me the next day. And I put on some music. And it was Dr. Thurman. It was early in the morning. Dr. Thurman was in bed. And I put on some great stuff. In 2 minutes, I heard him hustling. Put on the shoes, coming downstairs. Now, his broadness in an academic way was just out of this world.
What kind of jazz music did he like?
Oh, I like it all.
No, I mean with Dr. Thurman. Who were his favorite musicians?
Well, he was fond of most of the stuff. He would like blues. He would like jazz. On the other side of the fence, his classical music, but it probably, if I had to be arbitrary and say what could conceivably be the stuff that would move him most, it was spirituals. Mm-hmm. And he was expert in that area. But any kind of music that was well done, Thurman was your man. He wasn't, I'm trying to say in an indirect way, he wasn't a square at all. He would know blues. And if you heard him talk, you would be completely arrested by his ability to hold you. He wasn't ostentatious. You would just be as much drawn by the beauty of his speech as you would be about Ray Charles if you'd like to listen to the blues. In addition to that, I'm trying to answer your question. He was as relaxed and unostentatious as any man you've ever met in your life. If Thurman were walking downtown someplace, you'd run into somebody you didn't know who looked like a bum. The rapport between Thurman and that man would be as close as all talking together. His unusualness was in a kind of naturalness that was not ostentatious. He was attractive overwhelmingly in the sense that you would be as completely relaxed with him as you would with your granddaughter. It's hard to describe a man like Howard Thurman. He was not a beautiful man physically. He was paratoed. When he would walk on the stage to speak, you would be coerced into listening to everything he said. It's hard to describe Howard Thurman.
What was this? Now, you mentioned that you asked him to come and preach at your church. What was your favorite sermon that he gave?
Well, he didn't have a favorite sermon. I can't answer that question the way you want me to. But one of the things I can say that might interest you, almost all his, not all of them, but his favorite text would often be taken from the Old Testament. And his favorite text, in terms that he'd use it often, I don't know how much of a Bible student you are, But Thurman could make you sit as still as a mouse when he would recite the 139th Psalm. You will not have heard the 139th Psalm unless you heard Howard Thurman just recite that psalm. And the psalm would almost become like a text. If you heard somebody else read the 139th Psalm, and then you would hear Thurman do it, another ball game. I can remember when I was a student at Howard, the largest Baptist church in town had about 5,000 people in it. And they invited Thurman to be the preacher at, what do you call it, the weeks when you inviting people to join the church? Revival. Now, Thurman was no ordinary preacher. And when you had revivals, you'd have people who would be routine speakers. Where the sermon would, let's say, be down here. Thurman was possibly the most polished preacher you could ever find in that sense. And when they invited Dr. Thurman to be the speaker at one of the revival meetings, 2 or 3 dudes just chuckled. With the understanding, you don't invite a fellow like Thurman. But Thurman went. And I described Thurman this way. Thurman would throw up a flare here, and throw up another one here, working towards the end. In a revival, if you know anything about revivals and black life, rightly and justifiably, often people don't understand it, you can go to a revival meeting and it sounds like just routine stuff that people in a given psychological category would do. So you're supposed to get the people, stir it up. So the brothers were chuckling. Dr. Thurman's going to be preaching in Canada. But he went. And my description of the way he preaches, he would throw up a given kind of insightful flair here. Throw up another one here. And when he's working to the end, if you know anything about what preachers are supposed to be, you're supposed to get the folk. Throw up another flair here. He would be working toward his end. He was an odd preacher. And the folk were quiet. And as he would often do, he would work to the end of the sermon. He would either use a text like the Lord's Prayer or the 139th Psalm. And when he was doing what the boys would call going home, if he were using the Lord's Prayer as he said, he paused and he would say, "The Lord is my shepherd." The quality of the voice, the spell that he could bring in terms, using the same words. If you use those words, it will say one thing. His using another ballgame. And when you get to the last if he would do the 139th Psalm or the Lord's Prayer, in a typical African-American black church, you're supposed to get the rising, and he would wait until he would get the last statement. He would say, "Lord, is my shepherd." Did you hear the, what do we call, and James? The kind of reaction that you would get to normal preaching would come the moment that he would reach that point where he was stressing his say. A man like Thurman was not supposed to be able to do that the way he preached. But there was that in what you call almost indescribable charisma. He could do it almost every time you heard him speak. One or not others, I'll give you one more example. Again, Thurman was about 5'6", and he did more preaching. He did much more preaching. He probably did more college preaching than anybody you ever heard. And he was in Nebraska for the week of prayer. And he would walk slowly. When he stood up to get behind the pulpit, there were about, I guess, a couple of thousand students. This was a white school. He walked slowly to the pulpit, and they looked at him, and somebody giggled. Someone looked at him. He walked behind the pulpit, and there was a huge picture of Jesus. And after they laughed, someone looked at him, and he turned around and faced the picture of Jesus. He had a conversation with Jesus with his back turned to the audience for half an hour. He sat down. You know what the president did? The president asked Thurman, could he manage to stay at the school for another 2 days for conferences? That's as good an example I can answer your question with. He had drama. He had quality. He had humility. He had everything it took to focus you on what he was trying to get you to hear. It was for that reason that Thurman was he probably spoke to more people than any other preacher you could name. With all of that, he was as calm and relaxed as he could be. I don't know of many men who could be in his category. I think of 2 or 3 other men with the kind of talent that he had. That could come as close as a man could to shaping and changing your mind.
Reverend Rogers, what kind of an impact did Dr. Thurman have on people like say, Dr. King, for example?
Thurman's impact on almost any person who would be listening to material like sermons and lectures. The thing that's difficult to say well is because my description of the impact of his drama on you if anything, is less convicting than the quality of what he would be saying. You're listening to me up to this point might cause you to think you're listening to a man who's a kind of academic trick master. That's not the case. If you weigh what I told you thus far against the depth and the quality and the conviction of what he would say, that would be superior in my judgment than what might appear to be the tricks of an able speaker. You would enjoy reading Thurman's autobiography as much as you would enjoy listening to it. You had the combination of brilliance and depth and the ability not to be able to breathe loud when you're speaking. All of those things came together. All of them. That is what people ultimately come out understanding. Thurman could change your life. Alan and I talk about another man who speaks differently from Thurman, but who could do the same thing to you. You ever hear Benjamin Elijah Mays?
Oh, yes, sir.
He could do that to you. I think I mentioned him when I talked last time. Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays. You've not heard of Mordecai Johnson. Mordecai Johnson was the greatest preacher I ever heard in my whole life. When we dropped the bomb on Japan, I was at Howard University then. Mordecai Johnson was president of Howard University, which was a school owned by the United States. That's difficult to begin with.
Right.
The day they dropped the bomb, America dropped the bomb on Japan, Mordecai called together this entire student body and the faculty. This is the day after they dropped the bomb on Japan. Do you know what Mordecai did? He justified the Japanese dropping the bomb on America. I sat there. Your head could have been blown off of that. He talked an hour and a half. And we came out of the chapel. And we just stood there and looked at each other. If you'd heard the sermon, you would not have had any other choice than to justify what he said. Apart from the nerve of a man who could make a speech like that with no other expectation than getting your brain blown out. All of which is to say, when you have, I would say, the luck of being exposed to men like Dr. Thurman and Mordecai Johnson and Benjamin May and Martin Luther King. That kind of a moment can change your whole life. I didn't expect you to ask me questions like this, but that, in my judgment, is part of the stuff of the kind of change we've seen in a moment of life that both you and I have lived through. My long time before yours.
Well, and I think what's also very outstanding to think about is that when we think of social change, and when we think about the civil rights movement, how it's taught today, and most people would recognize that name of Martin Luther King. They would not recognize Howard Thurman's name. They would not recognize Mordecai Johnson's name. They would not recognize Benjamin Mays' name. And yet, there was organic connection between the four of them. Was there not?
Well, this is almost unavoidable connection.
Yeah.
Going back to the time I met you, there'd be hardly anybody that would know Doug Lee. Now, what I'm saying now might surprise you. I put Doug Lee in that class. There's something that ought to be included in the word charisma that changes the world. You think I sound like a fool if I told you that I thought Doug Lee is in that class. He is. First thing he said, he's a quiet man. He's as good a listener as I would be listening to Louis Armstrong. You didn't have the time to watch him when you were there, but he was writing when you were there. I could sit down with Doug Lee and talk to him like I'm talking to you, and all of these things would come out. Not because he wanted to talk to you. He's a very quiet man, on the one hand. On the other hand, if he had to move you, he could do that as easily as he could listen to when he had to do it. Doug Lee had genius. All of these men had that. So the name that you called when you said folk wouldn't recognize him, these were the people who were the unconscious architects of change that you wouldn't believe could come. I was born, again I reiterate, just a little less than 50 years after slavery. Deep thought will take you to men like these, and women like these for that matter too, that are the basis for the unbelievable change. Who would have thought that my grandmother could have been a slave, and now we have a black president? I think that the genius of change comes from places that you can't anticipate and that you don't expect. To go as far back as Martin King, despite the fact that we have a black president. Martin was unbelievable. Who did a lot of the wrong things. When you look at it wrong from the point of view of the way the world looks at it, I mean, Martin didn't have the slightest thought that he was going to be leading anything except to be a preacher and a PhD. Of course, everybody ought to be aware of it. Martin didn't have anywhere in his mind, hardly that you could see, that he was going to lead anything except to be a PhD and a good preacher of some type. Martin had no manifest idea that you come to that he wanted to lead anything except to be successful. Mm-hmm. And they named him. So the world is funny.
You know, I came this summer, Reverend Rogers, I'm really glad you mentioned that speech that Mordecai Johnson gave, because this summer I was doing some research and I came across Mordecai Johnson in the 1920s, I want to say. And it was soon after he had assumed the leadership at Howard, and he was giving a series of radio lectures, and he was giving them against American imperialism. And he was protesting the American occupation of Haiti and Nicaragua and I believe Honduras, or no, I'm sorry, the Dominican Republic. And the newspaper reports were quite flabbergasted that he would use the radio to speak out against the American occupation. But I just wanted to share that with you.
You do anything you thought necessary. That's why I mentioned. That's why I mean, not only was I stunned at Howard University, everybody was. The man condemned the United States of America. I think, of course, comparisons are odious. I know that. But if you ask, if I had to mention who I thought, I don't know, these sorts of statements are almost off the wall, including everybody I mentioned. If you made me name the man that I thought was the greatest preacher of all time, it would be Mordecai Johnson. It would be Mordecai Johnson. He would talk for 7 or 8 minutes, and then he'd stop. And the place would be as quiet as a booth shop. I mean, no, you'd be almost scared to move. The character of the truth that he would make explicit would just stun the daylights out of me. I don't know why there isn't more written about Mordecai. He was the first black president of Howard University. But the man people say, well, Mordecai talks too long. But if you didn't get there an hour ahead of time, you wouldn't get a seat. It would just be packed. I think that men of that type, and women too, for that matter, because there's some great women speakers. The biggest crowd we ever had at Stetson was when I think, what's the name? Angela Davis.
She's a great person. She's amazing.
You know what we had to do when we came out there? We had to close the hall doors. You didn't speak with her. She said we brought her to the big auditorium, and we couldn't get people in the building. Because she was a great person too.
Yeah.
I'm deliberately saying this because I do not want an unconscious feeling that I'm overlooking.
Yeah. Well, and Sue Bailey Thurman was a great person in her own right. Sue Bailey Thurman.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah. She was a different kind of person. You would have enjoyed watching Dr. Thurman and Mrs. Thurman work together. They were an overwhelmingly beautiful couple. Overwhelmingly beautiful. She was a pianist, you know, and she had a reputation in her own right. But after she married Dr. Thurman, she still had a career. But it's tough for two brilliant people to be together and then to however much it might sound wrong, it would be hard to be Dr. Thurman's wife and shine as much as you might shine if you weren't his wife. Because all of these people that we've been talking about today are simply overwhelmingly unusual people, and that's one of the reasons I'm glad I was lucky enough to come along at the time.
Well, you did some remarkable things. I wonder, with the few minutes that we have remaining, if you could tell me about what was your original goal with the Howard Thurman Lecture Series at Stetson? What was the spark that kind of led you to do that? I mean, it's unusual at a place like Stetson. Stetson had no prehistory that I'm aware of that would have led it to create on its own.
Well, the answer to that is easy. I was just the kind of preacher that I needed to be. In addition to the fact that, like many of us, I'm more indebted to the people I'm talking to you about than I am for anything I can say about myself. I think I told you about my encounter with Dr. May. Mm-hmm. That was a first-class miracle. So in my trying to answer that question, I would have to say the same things to you. Whatever justification at all for what I tried to do, credit belongs to these men. Billy Mays' relation to me was a first-class miracle. I had no more intention of doing what Dr. Mays wanted me to do than I have of jumping off his mouth. These men were makers of men. Martin Luther King Jr. has to say the same thing about Billy Mays that I said. These men were visionaries. Dr. Mays knew more about me than I did about myself. I had no intention of all. And after he wrote those 3 letters to me, later on I feel like calling myself a fool for running from a man like this. And then after that, as I told you, he had the damn audacity to write to my grandma. I picked up my bag the next day and I left. Who gets the credit for that? Benny Mays gets the credit for that. And in doing that, they taught people. I might have done some of it because that was my inclination to be a preacher or a history teacher or a lawyer. After, Allie and I talk about this a lot, after I read Benny Mays' books, especially his autobiography, I knew why he worked on me the way he did. He was similar to me ambition-wise. He had to make his own way. He could see my kind of doubt in what was really a goal. Benny Mays' greatness is as much present in his humility as any other characteristic. How many men you know would have spent that damn much time with me? You see? Here I am from a little country town like Clemson. And my ducking a man in a way that was almost insulting. He had more humility than I did. And it has been people like that who are responsible for growth. And it made me want to do what they did. I did a little bit of it, you see. And that's why I'm happy for this moment in life. I never thought I'd see a black president.
Do you remember where you were when you first heard about the news that Barack Obama had been elected president? What kind of feeling did you have when you first?
Well, I will confess, I did not think that was going to happen. I was wrong that time. Justifiably wrong. I thought that America was both too powerful and too ignorant. But I'm good at seeing backwards. I knew who was not going to be president. One of my very best friends. I've been close to a whole lot of folks. Jesse Jackson was a good friend of mine, although I wasn't that fond of Jesse. I had enough insight to know that Jesse wasn't going to be president, even though I lauded his ableness, but I didn't laud what he lacked. In a wrong way, but you see the point of my saying in a wrong way. Jesse was too ambitious to be top man. I was not surprised at Obama becoming president because he had the type of ability which included, how can I put this? Which included getting impossible things done with the beginning understanding that he couldn't do it himself. Right or wrong? I don't think using the term proud in my own time. I don't think Obama is what I normally consider being proud. Mm-hmm. I think that Obama's real interest was not, first of all, wanting to be president. He wanted to do what was meaningful, not to take bows, but to get it done. I think that Jesse Jackson, on a scale of what we would routinely call ableness, in that sense, was about as able as anybody I've ever seen. By the same token, I knew he would never become anybody's president. To use the term dangerously, Jesse couldn't be what he might have wanted to be because he wanted to be that more than he wanted to do the thing that could be done. Jesse is not a humble man, not by any stretch of the imagination. He's about as bright as anybody you could put a finger on. I worked with him. My church was one of the first churches of any significance that invited him to speak. He was very fond of Dr. Thurman. Dr. Thurman couldn't get rid of Jesse sometimes. He did not have the kind of equipment that could have possibly resulted in his becoming president because of how he was and because of how the American background is.
Right.
You see? Yeah. America had to believe in Obama. They had to believe in him in terms of what he could do to you, in terms of your appraisal of him. Mm-hmm. He could draw you on basis of the brilliance of what he was trying to focus on in terms of what he wanted America to be.
Yeah.
And right or wrong.
No, Reverend Rogers, I think that's a really excellent point that you're making. I mean, it reminds me of, we were talking earlier about Angela Davis. Now, I worked very closely with Angela Davis when I taught at Santa Cruz. We were on the same dissertation committees with students. And I was surprised at first because I didn't know, I mean, I knew obviously who Angela Davis was, but when I came to the university, I thought, wow, Angela Davis is here. That's an amazing thing. But it wasn't until I got to know her. And at the core of Angela Davis, you find that same kind of humility. She would be very quiet, an outstanding listener, but
that's my description of the pastor.
Yeah, very humble.
Yeah.
And people would be surprised. I mean, they would say, wow, you work with Angela Davis. She must have been a shining star. And I said, very often she was the last person in the room to say a word because she would wait and she wanted to hear what the student would have to say. And she was just that kind of person, is that kind of person, I should say. Yeah. But again, the humility.
Well, some people have it.
Yeah.
Some people have it. Oh, I hate to keep mentioning my former president, but I do put him.
Doug Lee, yeah.
I put Lee in the class. I put him in the class of Benny Mayer.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I'm sure there must have been a lot of opposition to the lecture series, right?
I mean, I think I told you, I didn't want to go there. Mm-hmm. We had 2 years of conversation because I've been in a racial relations work all my life, and you get tired. But then my common friend told me, he said, well, you need to know Doug Lee. So we talked for 2 years. You know, after I got to know Dougie, I'd jump over anybody's fence to work with a Doug Lee anytime. I mean, one of our ambitions, we were trying to get close to the White House. And I'd gotten some good people there. And my appraisal of Doug Lee, if there was any shot, if you're going to get a chance to listen to Doug Lee, I'll say him, he's bound to attract you. He's bound to attract you.
Yeah.
Because it is simply the honest to God truth that Doug Lee wanted to get things done that were meaningful. He didn't give a quarter about your stroking his head. And he knew how to go. And in that sense, I guess that those are the kinds of people that we need to find whenever they're available. And I'm not just putting you on about Doug Lee. I thought it was a very great man. So I'm glad you're still in the mill.
Well, I was, looking at that list of speakers that you and he brought to Stetson.
That's the one thing I give myself credit for.
That's incredible.
I thought I had the best. I thought I had the best online in the country.
Better, yeah. That's better than Harvard, better than Berkeley. I mean, that list of speakers in that time period, that's the premier intellectual force, or whatever metaphor you could choose. I mean, there's no other series like that. And
well, I'm sorry that I have to say that I agree with you, and that was what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
I was trying to raise the standard of insight with regard to the kind of learning necessary for the insight to develop.
Yeah.
With reference to what ought to be done apart from bowels of the fellow who's trying to do it.
Right.
That was, and quiet is kept. Quiet is kept. The people who were my best helpers were the people, more often than not, that I managed to get there the first time. I got my speakers did more to bring in folk that I wanted than I did. And if I had any secret, I had read all the people I invited, you see, and I used that. I used that because of a deep thing and a routine thing. My feeling was, if I'm talking to a man who has something on the ball, and I can let him know that I know what he has on the ball, I said to you, I read your book. I read everybody's book. And my spiel to them was their spiel, not mine. If I call you in, I said, look, man, I said, you got a hell of a book here. You said so and so and so and so and so and so. At least you're going to listen to it.
Right. Yeah.
And then a lot of the people would point to other people for me. And I never invite, I haven't invited one speaker whose books I had not read. And that helps.
Yeah. Well, and the quality of those speakers that you bring out, I mean, I was thinking of this because the speaker who came out after I spoke that year was Leon Litwack. And I just love Leon. Leon had a special relationship with John Hope Franklin, who I think you knew. And John Hope and Leon you'd see them at the Southern Historical Association. And the only reason I would go to that conference would be to see these two men in their well into their mid-80s.
Well, you aired that to begin with. That's the point.
Well, and they would lean on each other. They would walk arm in arm, Leon and John Hope, you know, and they just had this incredible relationship with each other. And Leon, his students loved him at Berkeley. It was so unusual because Berkeley had become such a big, almost like factory of education. Very little interaction between the professors and the students. Leon was an exception. The year he retired, every lecture that he gave at Berkeley was just a packed theater. Students who did not major in history, who knew nothing about black studies, would come just to see him because he had that kind of reputation. He loved his students. And I mean, he would come in with a leather jacket and quoting blues songs. I'll never forget a lecture he gave at the Southern Historical Association. He talked about the rise and fall of the civil rights movement. He used music. He used jazz, he used Motown, and then he got to the 80s. And he said, you know, you could tell the quality of the society was changing by the name of the bands.
Yeah, that's true.
Public Enemy. You know, he said earlier you had the Supremes, the Marvelettes, and now you had a new kind of band, new kind of musicians who were only responding to the changes in society that they were seeing. And the music got more skeptical.
Music is a big thing now.
Big thing now, yeah. And he was quoting lyrics, hip hop lyrics. and a man who was 80 years old was quoting hip hop lyrics. Mm-hmm. And these other historians were saying, "What?" They were so, what?
Well, we talk about music incessantly here. My son is a music student unawares. I mean, if it's music in a given level, you're likely to find some of it here.
Yeah.
And the promotion of people who have the desire to learn. We had a fellow who would be who lives right next to Miami, You know where he would be every one of our nights of speaking? He'd be here. I mean, just automatically. He learned to love learning. And it dawned on him that when we brought here, there was going to be somebody he ought to hear.
Yeah.
And again, I go back to my first patient. I mean, my first person like that was Doug Lee. You see.
Yeah.
So did I tell you what I would never do? I'm radical, but I'm wise. I didn't want a president who would be disturbed by the folk I would bring. Uh-huh. So when I passed this test, I knew I had it made. I said to Doug, Doug, what would you think about bringing Stokely and Carmichael here? He jumped up and clicked both ears. I knew I had it ready then. I didn't have to ask that question anymore. Uh-huh. And when you get that kind of openness, you are able to promote a reputation that makes it easy for you to get big speakers. Because when I brought X speaker, I know when I brought X speaker, he was going to tell Y speaker, that's the place to go.
Yeah.
And I didn't have hardly. What are you writing now?
I'm writing, well, a few different things. One is I'm working on, I've recently been asked to work on the memoirs of Stetson Kennedy. And Stetson, lived in Jacksonville for a long time. He worked with Zora Neale Hurston. He worked with Woody Guthrie. He exposed the Klan in the 1940s. So I'm working on that. I'm also working on a book. It's a Southwide book about the Jim Crow period.
Jim Crow?
About the 1880s.
When are you going to finish that?
That's probably 4 or 5 years off.
I see.
The book I'll probably finish first is I'm working on a text, and I was really happy to hear you talk about Native American history, but I'm working on a book now about comparing African American and Latino history.
Oh, yeah.
Looking at the two histories in relationship to each other. And Mordecai Johnson came up because I was looking.
You'd be on the right burner. We haven't had a good book on Mordecai.
Uh-huh.
I have one book.
Yeah. That's a great, I'm going to talk to my graduate students about that.
I lectured with a guy when I was at Howard who had written the one book on Mordecai. I don't think it's as good as it ought to be. Mm-hmm. I don't know when you're going to finish these other books, but this is a wise tip.
It is.
The fact is, I'm taking a big jump here. Mm-hmm. I've told you what I believe. I believe that Mordecai Johnson is a better speaker than most of the speakers that we've named. Mm-hmm. There isn't a good book out on it.
No, there isn't.
You would hit payday if you could come close to doing for Mordecai Johnson what you did for Quincy. You'd have a bestseller. I don't know why. I don't know why that hadn't been jumped on.
Yeah.
I don't know why that hadn't been jumped on. But you got you're writing 2 books now.
Well, I'll tell my graduate students. I have some good graduate students, and we can get them, maybe I can convince 1 or 2 of them to start working on it, for their dissertations. And
well, I won't hold you too much longer. The thing that is up my sleeve with you is I'm not going to be around much longer, but we're getting a new group together, and of course you know what my luck has been. I've been behind the 8 ball. My wife and I were closer than you can imagine, and I've had trouble with that. But the same dream that I had 12 years ago. Is alive in a major way, largely because of what we've achieved, and because I have potentially a better staff. Most of what has been done in the past, I had to do more of it myself than any other people, but I got a great staff now. I think that the character of what you've already done and the ableness that you bring in making life out of important data in the African-American world as it is coming closer together with other aspects of our world. And because I think that picture is getting better, I'd like to talk to you about, because I'm going to be, my ambition has been to make this area as much as, if not more, than other areas that have already arrived in the doing of what is a continuation of what I've been after to make over into a regular thrust in the total world of ours here, with a categorical uplift in the black world. We are overwhelmingly interested in that, plus two other things, which is what we've been working on. My main man is at Harvard. And the big thing that we were working on, as I think I mentioned to you before, is the prison thing.
Yeah.
The second thing is to make the black world a center from which we can eliminate functionally the togetherness of the so-called black world and the so-called white world to create a kind of new world. I was told before I tried to come here that this was the last place I ought to come to. But we've done away with that to an extent. The loss of Doug Lee and the coming of this inept woman is taking his place. I want a continuation of what we've done pretty well on in laying the foundation for. Making the functional center not to move away from lifting Stetson, but Stetson is no longer Stetson because Doug Lee is not there and I'm not there. I want to keep all of the doors open on basis of the kind of quality of what I put the finger on that's comparable to the fact that we now have seen a change that's comparable to what I'm thinking about in the fact that we have not simply a black president, but an able president. The lady who's going to be working with me, I don't know if you know Inez Reed, but she's a senior judge now.
Inez Reed?
Inez Reed.
Okay.
She was the person who wrote me my first letter from my first big church in Washington, D.C. So we've known each other a long time. She has two brothers who are PhDs. There are three of them in the family. All of them are PhDs. But the significance is not the PhD. They are overwhelmingly bright people. You see? Now, given the fact that you've written one book that is key to what we're making an effort to do, I'd like to talk you into coming back down here again. With this new impetus that will be a continuation of what you've already been a part of, alongside of the intellectual and political lifting of a community that's always been here. To do this. You see? We have not tried these things like this as much as we ought to have because we've been down here. I want to bring it here, with the here including a lifting that is as academically factual as it is in terms of what we call class writing. I want the intellectual ableness to be comparable to what also goes along with class writing. One of the unkind things that I would say, I don't think Stetson has a ghost of a chance of doing what we've done. I don't think the president can do that. I don't think the ambition of lifting a world is there. I don't think football is going to do that. I don't think basketball is going to do that. I want learning and ableness that learning is necessary for to become factual in terms of the doing of what needs to be done. That's my opening speech to you. I've got some new folk too. I don't know if you read the book that you looked at the other day.
Oh yeah, the Hamilton.
That's a great book.
Yeah.
That's a great book.
Yeah.
And my interest is to cultivate you, even if I have to make an effort to get you here even before you get these other two books written. You see, we've raised the consciousness in an intellectual way that's different from mere big names, but to factual movement, so that the people get excited to find out they ought to be learning a hell of a lot more than they are learning. I want to be a kind of thrill in what we're doing. And again, I won't keep it. Again, as I told you about, I think the world might be ready for a dip into the sociological meaning of what eruditeness in the arena of music can bring. I want to get into that. I don't know how much you've been reading in that line, but we're at a heavy point at that point. Think about that for the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
I would. We're going to begin the new program, which is the same program almost, beginning the next academic year. Mm-hmm. And I want to be talking to you about getting you here, whether or not the new book is involved, because we could build on what we've been talking about for these years. And you're a little closer than you were last time.
Right, yeah. Well, you call and I will come.